This paper deals with the fashion film Le Mythe Dior, which presented the Autumn-Winter 2020 to 21 Haute Couture collection for the storied fashion house Dior. I argue that Dior creative director Maria Grazia Chiuri, together with the film's director Matteo Garrone, present classical mythology and culture in a fairy tale style, and that the film claims both antiquity and fairy tales as Italian. Chiuri's reception of ancient Greece and Rome thus emphasizes her Italianness even as she helms a major Parisian maison. The subject of Dior's receptions well suits the mission of this conference to address the vitality of antiquity in current popular culture, because the brand has a high degree of influence and a broad reach both among elites and within aspirational culture. To use a term applied to fashion by theorist Pierre Bourdieu, Dior bears enormous cultural capital. The Metropolitan Museum's Costume Institute and numerous media outlets have characterized the Maison as venerable. Of the house's founder, Christian Dior, fashion historian Valerie Steele writes that in the decade between the establishment of his label in Paris in 1947 and his untimely death 10 years later, Monsieur Dior was, quote, the most famous designer in the world, unquote. Among his successors have been several high-profile figures in their own right, including John Galliano and current creative director Maria Grazia Chiuri, who had already been co-artistic director of the major Italian house Valentino. A blockbuster Dior exhibition is currently on view at the Brooklyn Museum. Celebrities frequently wear Dior on the red carpet, including actor Jennifer Lawrence just this month. The film that is the subject of this talk, Le Mythe Dior, released in mid-2020, has been viewed over 1.7 million times on YouTube and more than 2.7 million times on Instagram. This level of prestige and exposure means that the Dior brand's engagements with classical antiquity bear significant potential to shape popular culture ideas about the ancient world and about its continuing relevance in contemporary society. The 15-minute fashion film presents highlights from the house's Autumn-Winter 20 to 21 couture collection, designed by Chiuri. The film was released in July 2020 in lieu of the customary runway presentation, the staging of which was precluded by COVID concerns. Chiuri chose feature filmmaker Matteo Garrone to direct the film, and the two reportedly storyboarded it together. The setting of the film is a serene, leafy forest dotted with old stone walls. Two young men dressed like 1940s-style bellhops carry a dollhouse-like trunk decorated like the Dior building in Paris and filled with miniature Dior gowns and day looks that the bellhops display to the members of the forest's fantastical population. The conceit of the traveling trunk, Chiuri has explained, alludes to the 1945 to 46 Théâtre de la Mode, a touring exhibition of one-third life-size couture on doll-like mannequins that was intended to revive French fashion in the wake of World War II, shortly before Monsieur Dior set up his own shop. The 6 characters who shop the dollhouse in Le Mythe Dior are identified in the credits. The first is a sirène, a mermaid, followed by Le Nymphe Dior, accompanied by a troupe of attendants. Next is a curious femme coquillage, from whom the carriers of the trunk take measurements. The bellhops then pass Narcisse, who looks up only briefly from his reflection, and they show a Dior jacket to another nymph, who receives approval from a ram-horned fawn. Bellhops continue on to an animate statue of Venus, and finally to the female half of a kissing pair of tree sprites. Back in the atelier, female artisans sew each customer's selected design. The film concludes with the recipients of the new garments frolicking, reposing, canoodling, or in the mermaid's case, swimming in their new ensembles. Numerous aspects of the film draw upon Greek and Roman antiquity. Fashion critic Tim Blanks reports that Chiuri and Garrone found inspiration in, among other things, quote, Ovid's classic Metamorphoses, Rome itself, and the legends that missed Rome's ancient ruins, unquote. The very title signals that the film is a reception of myth, and at least most of the characters, obviously excluding the bellhops, relate to classical myth to a greater or lesser degree, and in some cases also to other aspects of ancient Greece and Rome, as well as to a panoply of intermediary receptions of antiquity. The most classicizing character is probably the statue of Venus. She is nude, like her namesakes from the Praxitelean era onward, and made up from head to toe in a grayish-white cosmetic, its monochromatic palette reflecting the belief that persists in contemporary popular culture that ancient marble statuary was uniformly white, despite scholarly efforts to counteract this impression, as in the recent International Gods in Color exhibition. The Dior figure's pose does not, to my knowledge, correspond in detail to any ancient iconographic formulae for Venus, but it broadly evokes the widespread crouching Aphrodite ancient statue type, and it more closely echoes the neoclassical sculpture in the Borghese Gallery in Rome of Pauline Bonaparte as Venus Victrix by Antonio Canova. The Dior statue's hair, pulled back in waves from a central part, resembles the coiffures of the crouching Aphrodite in the Venus de Milo, as well as of some other ancient Aphrodite figures. A stickler might point out that the ivy crown is not a classical attribute of Venus, but the foliate wreath generally is, of course, a well-known Greek and Roman motif. The gown made for and worn by the Dior statue of Venus is described in the credits as a robe peplum, rendering explicit its homage to the ancient Greek peplos. The Dior dress, christened Lee, conforms to the modern gown type that fashion journalists call the goddess dress. The term refers to a usually floor-length gown with a sleeveless bodice, a natural high or cinched waist, the former evoking the dress styles of the French Empire and neoclassical eras. Often a white or light palette, again resonating with perceptions of ancient marble statues as white, and clinging drapery, achieved in the Lee dress through plissé, the use of tight crinkle-like folds in a lightweight fabric. The torsade ornamentation of the bodice, the twisted cord overlay, may call to mind the looping band that occasionally appears in ancient art worn crossed at the breasts by Amazon and by some other, usually active female figures. At the center of Botticelli's classicizing Primavera, moreover, Venus wears strips of embroidery in a similar configuration. The mermaid and shell woman also receive goddess dresses, and other looks in the collection incorporate goddess-style traits as well. As for the Sirène and the Femme Coquillage Croix characters in the film, I will address them in a few moments. For non-specialist viewers, I think stronger references to classical mythology likely come from the characters of the nymphs, both the group splashing in the pond and the single nymph pursued by a faun, as well as from Narcissus, whose pose calls to mind, vaguely at least, the Caravaggio painting of that subject. Furthermore, both the transparent, haphazardly slung drapery of the nymphs and the red rectangle of cloth covering the otherwise nude Narcissus recall the garments of figures in Botticelli's Primavera, and also find precedence for Narcissus in several Pompeian frescoes. The ruins in the landscape could perhaps initially appear, at least to untrained eyes, as ancient Roman, given the bridge's rounded arches and the masonry that is not terribly dissimilar in appearance to Roman Byzantium. The structures in the film are, however, medieval. The setting is, in fact, the Giardini di Ninfa in southern Lazio, a territory that has been controlled by the elite Italian Caetani family since the late 13th century, albeit with varying levels of success. And while the Rome-based Chiuri and Garrone must have found the convenience of this location appealing during the pandemic lockdown, The result is, for those who recognize it, a backdrop of an Italian forest redolent of the Italian Middle Ages. I propose that Chiuri and Garrone's choice of the Giardini di Ninfa setting is one of the ways that they linked and even elided classical antiquity with specifically Italian fairy tales in Le Mythe d'Or. Chiuri has said that she knew from the outset that her pandemic fashion film had to be indebted, quote, al sogno, al fantastico, to dreams, to the fantastical. For this reason, she says she immediately thought of Garrone, and specifically of his 2015 feature film, The Tale of Tales. The plot and mise-en-scène of The Tale of Tales, Garrone has explained, are rooted in Il Pentamerone, the 1630s collection of Neapolitan fairy tales compiled by Italian author Giambattista Basile. The subtitle or alternate title of Il Pentamerone is, in fact, Il Conto degli Conti, The Tale of Tales. Stay on that slide for a second. Le Mythe d'Or shares many qualities in common with Garrone's Tale of Tales. The scene of La Nymphe d'Or wearing her chosen dress gala, for example, resonates strongly with the courtly scenes in Garrone's fairy tale feature film. La Nymphe d'Or stands like a queen between ladies-in-waiting, with other members of her court close at hand, and within a space defined by medieval walls, albeit crumbling ones. Gala is velvet, a material adopted by European royalty starting in the 14th century, and the credits describe its color as or passé, old gold. The credits also call gala a robe toge, a toga dress, presumably because of the diagonal draping of the bodice. But the extremely long flared sleeves assimilate the dress to the 15th century flared-sleeved houppelande, or in Italian la pelanda, as well as to the dress worn by Selma Hayek as the queen in Tale of Tales, including on this movie poster. The hairstyles of all the nymphs in Le Mythe d'Or are mostly or entirely loose and very, very long. In ancient Greek and Roman art, Nereids sometimes wear a few locks falling onto their shoulders, especially in North African mosaics, but some wear all their hair tidily gathered up into a bun, and never is a Nereid's hair anywhere near as long as that of her Dior counterparts. The Dior nymph's hairstyles much more closely resemble that of the virgin character in The Tale of Tales, down even to its distinctive shade of red. The characters of the Sirène and the Femme Coquillage are mostly the stuff of fairy tales as well, although they perhaps evoke myth for some viewers, at least vaguely. The designation Sirène here, of course, means mermaid, half woman, half fish, a fixture of the medieval bestiary, who makes a cameo as well in the Lattrell Psalter, which I'm showing here. But the word Sirène might also bring to mind the mythological sirens. The woman who emerges nude from a shell on the water might lead a classicist to think of the Venus Anadyomene, and the general public to recall Botticelli's Birth of Venus, but the Dior figure's shell is a conch rather than a scallop. Both figure, or perhaps a snail shell. Both figures more vividly embody the type of strange, often hybrid creature that abounds in fairy tales and helps to characterize the genre. Let me see if I can play for you a bit of the soundtrack of Le Mythe d'Or. I hope you can hear that. Even the gentle lulling soundtrack, performed on a celesta or bell piano, according to a music scholar colleague of mine, even this soundtrack puts one in mind of the Middle Ages. Its lightly chiming refrain recalling the delicate sounds of the late medieval dulcimer. What is the significance of Chiuri and Garrone's melding of references to antiquity and the ambiance of fairy tales in this Dior fashion film? Initially, when I wrote my abstract for this talk, I conceived of the film's fairy tale qualities as Gallic, as nods to the Frenchness of the Dior label. After thinking more, though, about what Chiuri and Garrone say themselves concerning the film, I now instead propose that Le Mythe d'Or claims both antiquity and the fairy tale tradition as part of its collaborators' inheritance as Italians. I return specifically to the quote from the Tim Blanks interview with Chiuri. You remember it cites as sources of inspiration for the film Ovid, Rome, and the legends that missed Rome's ancient ruins. It also names the Pentamerone of Basile, the same Italian fairy tale collection on which Garrone's Tale of Tales depends. When Blanks points out, in response to Chiuri's list of influences, that Dior is a French fashion house, Chiuri replies, quote, "The references were so French, but we translated them with my language, and our way to work was so Italian," unquote. For Chiuri, then, the film does refer to French fairy tales, but it recasts them as Italian. Garrone, moreover, places classical mythology in the same family tree as the fairy tales on which he draws. Excuse me. In an Instagram video posted on the same day Le Mythe d'Or was released, Garrone says, and I'll quote the English subtitles, "In this film we made in collaboration with Maria Grazia, we go back to the origin of the fairy tale, or rather to the myth, to Greek mythology." I submit that Chiuri and Garrone conceived not only of Basile's fairy tales, but also of antiquity, both Roman and Greek, as Italian patrimony. Certainly, many prominent contemporary Italian fashion designers claim antiquity as such. I think historian David Lowenthal's definition of heritage is useful here. Lowenthal frames heritage as a construct intended to foster a sense of identity, belonging, and pride. In this vein, Italian luxury designers use myriad means to construct ancient Rome and Greece as Italian heritage. Their uses of classicizing motifs and garment styles are much too legion to mention. The well-known Versace logo of the Gorgonian will have to stand in here for all of them. Numerous Italian houses have sponsored blockbuster restorations of ancient sites. Tod's, for example, is underwriting the Colosseum refurbishment, and Fendi is funding work at the Temple of Venus in Rome, where the house held a runway show in 2019. Many other Italian labels have likewise held shows or photo shoots in or near ancient ruins, as Stacey Rauchi has discussed. Stacey also being a member of AIMS. Many of the sites in question are Roman or Italian, or in Italy, and Roman, but some are in Italy and Greek. Gucci has been on location at the Greek Theater and Temples at Selinunte in Sicily, for instance, and Dolce & Gabbana has staged a show at the same venue. This past June, Chiuri herself went to Greece to use the Panathinaikos Stadium as a runway and held a Dior photo shoot on the Athenian Acropolis. The photos from the latter are still, this month, filling pages in major newspapers. I propose that Chiuri views her receptions, both of antiquity and of fairy tales, as expressions of her Italianness. Chiuri was born in Rome, attended the Istituto Europeo di Design in that city, cut her teeth at Fendi, and was co-creative director at Valentino before being appointed the head of Dior in 2016. She still lives and works in Rome. Chiuri would not be the first Dior creative director to bring a style to the Maison associated with her native or adopted homeland. Gibraltar-born John Galliano, for example, infused Dior with the flair and costume aesthetic of his days with the Blitz Kids in London, while Raf Simons, Chiuri's immediate predecessor, introduced into the Dior style some of the minimalism characteristic of his native Belgium. Chiuri's distinctly Italian adaptation of the Dior aesthetic, I submit, by conclusion, is expressed in the Mythe d'Or through engagements with two pasts. One is classical antiquity, evoked among other things by mythological characters, goddess dresses, and interpretations of ancient statues. The other is the imaginary medieval past, as it figures in fairy tales, conjured through Chiori's collaboration with Garrone and the reception of Basile's Pentamerone. To return to our conference mandate of demonstrating the vitality of antiquity today, because of Dior's significant cultural influence, Le Mythe Dior may well serve to remind the public that antiquity can furnish the basis for high-quality, innovative, and visually sumptuous creative endeavors. We, however, as classical reception scholars, should also recognize that the Dior film's version of antiquity is crossbred with the fairy tale genre to produce a world that is fantastical, nature-based, playful, and strange, a world that its audience might read simply as classical. Le Mythe Dior's world is also, as some fashion critics have pointed out, inhabited entirely by white people, not to mention thin and young people. But that issue will have to be the subject of a different paper. I thank you very much for digitally attending my talk.